Hello and welcome to episode 43 of the 905er podcast. I'm Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
On today's episode, we welcome Joey Coleman, editor of the publicrecord.ca, back to discuss the latest news from Hamilton City Council. Last week, Joey reported on the proposal by the city clerk to prevent letters critical of councillor behaviour being submitted to council and included in the public record. Supportive letters are allowed. It's only letters alleging impropriety that are banned. If a Hamilton citizen wants to suggest a councillor was out of line, they'll need to pay $100 and submit a complaint to the Integrity Commissioner. The same Integrity Commissioner, which is a company owned by the city's own former solicitor. In other words, somebody whose previous career was to defend the city against all complaints. The same Integrity Commissioner which upheld a complaint against a citizen for tweeting information already in the public domain, but with only one exception, has dismissed complaints against councillors. So, welcome back to the podcast. Pretty much our first repeat guest, Joey Coleman, editor of Hamilton's The Public Record. And we invited Joey back today to talk about more happenings at Hamilton Council, which seems to be almost a weekly state of affairs at the moment. And the one that particularly piqued our interest was that the City of Hamilton is currently looking at revising some of their procedures of how council operates. And as part of that, they have suggested not allowing people to send letters to council that are critical of councillors. So, Joey, I mean, that's my very superficial background to it, but perhaps you could give us the more detailed version of what's going on here.
So it's almost become an annual tradition where the city clerk and city solicitor bring forth a report that officially is housekeeping amendments, but there's always these interesting things which are designed to react to the city clerk's political concerns about activities that I don't even know how we phrase it. I'll use the term that the deputy city clerk used to describe my podcast, where I interviewed all the candidates. It was considered an anti-incumbent activity, the theory being that the media partners do not traditionally cover races where there's an incumbent, whereas I was going out and covering every race, which meant that candidates who were challenging incumbents were getting interviewed. And, by definition, a election is an anti-incumbent activity. So, the city clerk brings this amendment that would say that any letter that is critical of the behavior of a councillor or the council will not be put on the agenda. We have people are writing letters asking councillors to act befitting of their public office. Some councillors are unhappy with this. And then we have this amendment to the procedural bylaw to say that any communications that are critical of council behavior will not be put on the agenda, will not be made public, and instead will be sent to council's integrity commissioner, which has originally written, this was this very general, this is what we're going to do, no more letters critical of council behavior, which of course violates our charter rights of expression. Citizens who, especially in the case where you have an integrity commissioner that has deemed councillors are allowed to assault people without consequence, councillors are allowed to threaten people on social media without consequence, threats which Twitter suspended a city councillor. And, when you've reached the threshold that Twitter says you've gone too far, you might have gone too far. So, of course, I challenged this. I wrote a letter to council explaining to them that, they may, and I actually said suggested reading is a grade 10 civics textbook, that we have the right to express our displeasure, that I have the right to say, whereas council voted 13-2 to say that they can assault people and be exempt from the city's zero tolerance for violence policy. I have the right to disagree with that. I have the right to say, no, I actually think that you should not be assaulting people. that you should be acting as adults. But I didn't just leave it there. I actually did the proper and legal analysis, provided them case law, and explained to them in excruciating detail that you can't do this. What has become of this is that on Thursday, Council met in its Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee, and they further amended this particular section that now it states communications which are in substance an allegation of a violation of the Code of Conduct or Municipal Conflict of Interest Act will be returned to the writer, who will be advised of the mechanisms for bringing the allegations to the Integrity Commissioner. Now, what that has done, instead of a blanket ban, this is actually proper in that what's the pressing and substantive objective? The pressing and substantive objective is that the Municipal Act states that the Integrity Commissioner is supposed to deal with these matters. So making sure that it gets triaged to the Integrity Commissioner first off. Now, a citizen can turn around and say, I don't want to go to the Integrity Commissioner, I want this on the agenda. At that point, this does not prohibit it going on the agenda. That's going to be an interesting moment. One of the things with Hamilton City Hall is that they're usually full of bluster, but the second that citizens uphold their own rights, City Hall backs down. So those letters will get through, but it does undermine public confidence once again. That instead of writing this amendment, writing this rule has the amendment now says in the first place, which is the proper way to write a bylaw, a proper way to engage in it. It was this blanket statement. And what it came down to was that I made very clear to the city, I'll take you to court. I'll get a judge to explain to you, you can't do this. And then they actually went, oh, how do we properly do this? Instead of in the first place doing it properly, which would have resulted in all of us going, okay, kind of makes sense. And this is getting to the long-standing problem that we're seeing more and more as we discussed with the Integrity Commissioner one, where what does the law say? Well, the law says this, but for some reason our City Hall here in Hamilton decides they want to achieve an objective, and it may not be in keeping with the law, but they're going to try until somebody says, grade 10 civics here, folks, you can't do that.
Why are we even going down this route? I mean, why the necessary decision to prohibit negative opinions being expressed by citizens to Hamilton City Council? I mean, I've always figured that part of one of our cornerstones of democracy is that if I have a grievance with the behavior of one of my elected officials, I should be able to voice that grievance publicly and have it addressed.
Yes, and I'll use the term critical letters, because what they're looking for is the concern's critical, not that they're negative, but that they're critical. Right. Negative letters can easily be dismissed. It's the critical, thoughtful letters, when you have lawyers who come in front of council as citizens to discuss road safety and instead are grilled by counselors as having nefarious agendas because they say, I don't want cars driving past the speed limit on residential streets. And so this is where this clash is occurring. And a lot of it actually has to do with the Hamilton politics. It's the reason that City Hall has got a vendetta against me is because they can't control me. They have no leverage or influence over me, but I am symptomatic of a larger change in society in that citizens can now directly engage. Citizens can organize outside of the controlled channels that used to exist pre-internet. And City Hall is ultimately attempting to exert control where it shouldn't. And the ironic bit of this is that it merely results in more of what they do not want. Citizens don't go to City Hall and get disengaged before. And I spent some time in the public library archives before COVID, and there's always been these citizens who really take on City Hall in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but they get burned out and then they disappear. And so City Hall has been able to do that for so long that they presume that that's going to be the result now. But because we can network, as citizens, that's not happening. And in fact, like when we talk about the council ban on letters critical of their behavior, most citizens don't bother to send a letter to council saying, please act like adults, because they know it's a waste of time. Council's not going to respond by acting like adults. But now that you say I cannot send a letter to City Hall, now people are going, oh, well, I think I'll send a letter to make the point that I can.
So, I mean, two points arise to me from this. I mean, the first is that it seems kind of like a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and that what harm do letters do, even if they are critical? I mean, obviously, they can be inconvenient to certain members of council, but so what? I mean, that's part of their job. And the other one is that by making an issue out of things like this, they attract so much greater public disapproval to themselves than they would just by doing nothing.
When you look at other municipalities that have reached this stage,
it's bad politics apart from anything else.
Just
why
insanity.
do they keep on doing this?
Is that it's spiraled out of control because there's a lack of leadership, both on the staff side and on the council side. There is a growing sense of panic, both on the council side and the staff side, that things have spiraled out of control. The public has had enough. They were able to cover up the Red Hill and Coots and IT past the 2018 election. They knew about it. They intentionally chose not to make public information because they wanted to assist the re-election campaigns of the incumbents, which is not the role of a professional staff. A professional staff's job is to make public information. And so they recognize that the public has a disdain for them to a point now where it's throw out the bumps. And we saw that in Guelph in 2006, and that was about the Walmart development and how the Walmart development was proceeded with in Guelph, and you had a citizens movement that just cleared house. We saw that in London, Ontario, and Niagara Region in the last municipal election. And when you clear house, you can't just clear the politicians. The new politicians have to come in and clear out the staff who have become loyal, not to their service to the public, but loyal to the politicians who have just been removed from office. And it becomes a spiral where everything internally, there's a bunker mentality where everything is an oversized threat. And if we can just take care of this one threat here and take that sledgehammer to a mosquito, that somehow that'll end everything. But instead, what you've done is you've just cracked the entire foundation of your house with the sledgehammer on that mosquito.
What you're saying is so incredibly familiar to me from Burlington, and Burlington had a similar process, and that there was very much a regime change in 2018. It is such an important point that it's not just the council, it's not just the staff. There's a combined culture that develops there that is extremely problematic. That feeling of paranoia, of bunker mentality is so prevalent when you spend any time in these with these institutions. But I mean, in Hamilton, I have to say, from what I can see, takes it to a whole other level or extremity, I should say.
Well, Hamilton is taking it to an extreme, but we've seen this play out in other municipalities before. The difference is that we haven't seen it play out in a over 500,000 single tier municipality. And that does make it a bit unique. But it's also unnecessary. I mean, quite literally, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the work of the city must continue. So it's not that, other things do not occur at the city, but these types of priorities where you just go, how is this what these people are spending their time on? How is this what the city clerk's spending their time on when, for example, we're 18 months out from the municipal election. We don't know what that looks like. We don't know if we're going to be dealing with variants of COVID that we must be careful in terms of distancing, that type of thing. And like, there's all kinds of better priorities to spend our time on. And frankly, from my end, I'm a policy nerd. In a way, this let me, nerd out on here's the basics of civil rights as it relates to municipal expression. But I'd rather do something more substantive with my time.
Just I'm reading on your article on the website. You mentioned that it was the city clerk and the solicitor who presented this to council, and I'm wondering, maybe you can clarify, where did this initiative come from? Was it come from the clerk and the solicitor, or was this under some kind of direction from a city councilor to go down this? Like, where did this fiasco originate from?
We don't know. This is actually one of the really big problems with governance at Hamilton City Hall. The day we're recording this, which is Friday, February 5th, we had a council meeting today where Councillor Maureen Wilson, Ward 1, who's one of the new councillors, was chairing. And decorum was starting to slip. People were getting testy with each other, and she asked for decorum by saying, please choose your words carefully. Don't refer to something as a silly idea because you're disparaging the person who's brought forth the idea. Be more thoughtful in your approach. And the mayor freaked out. How dare you? And the video clip is just unbelievable. But this is what we're dealing with, is somebody asked in a very polite manner. There was no passive aggressiveness to it. It was simply put, hey, we're public officials. We're in a public meeting. Let's be thoughtful in our approach to not undermine each other. And the mayor freaked out. And so this is where ultimately, and I tweeted this, which is ultimately the way of fixing council in Hamilton is not rules. It's no longer procedure. It's about fixing the personalities. Mm-hmm. And that means when we go to the ballot box in 2022, being thoughtful about who we elect and the type of people we elect. And that's something that journalists normally don't say because you burn your access. And the first priority of a lot of journalists is to maintain a certain level of access. It's necessary for the job. And again, this gets to, I stream the Accountability and Transparency Committee. City Hall decides I need to be run out of town. And the great advantage I have is I'm reader funded, so I can say what needs to be said, which is, in Hamilton, our problem is personalities. And that's why, getting back to your question of who initiated this, it could have been any of them.
That's a scary thought if you step back and think about it, is that's where we're coming down to, is that it's a personality that says, I don't like having somebody say something bad or criticize my plans. So I'm going to take it upon myself to just start shutting down debate. It's a scary idea, especially in light of what we've seen around the world with democracies. I know it's just Hamilton, but this all starts somewhere.
And could you just give us the background to the video story as well, for anybody who hasn't heard it, that you have been doing something that I would think any city with a brain would want people to do, which is making sure people get access to videos of council meetings, and not just council meetings, but the advisory committee meetings and things like that. What a wonderful thing to do. And the reaction to that has been ...
Absolute warfare. I have been harassed, retaliated against, assaulted twice now at Hamilton City Hall, all for asking for basic public information. It's an interesting thing when you think about what I've gone through, and the fact that, at some point I'll write my memoirs and tell my life story. I was a Crown Ward. You don't end up in foster care because your childhood's good. And so this violence and intimidation I can handle because of those experiences, which is not it's a resiliency, but it's a resiliency that shouldn't be necessary. Yeah, it's been this interesting thing where I brought a camera into public meetings, allowed people to see what council's doing, and that changed everything. And this happens in other industries as well. It's not uncommon that somebody comes in and changes the rule book by doing something that makes a lot of sense to those of us who are outside of that system. But for the people inside the system, it means that they've lost control. And so, for example, and these were interesting battles where the city would go to the Ontario Municipal Board and drag me to the OMB to try to grill me as if there was some nefarious agenda I had. Because what would happen is people would go to the OMB and the city would submit a set of minutes that said, this is what happened. And the video would actually show, no, something else occurred. And then you get in a battle over evidence. The OMB now accepts my videos without question. But that was an example of where the power imbalance changed, where the city no longer could say, this is what happened. The citizen then says, no, that's not what happened. And then the board goes, well, you need to prove that, citizen, you need to prove that B happened when the city says A, because now the citizen can come in and say, well, actually, here's the video that proves this is what occurred. And so in the case of Lloyd Ferguson, who as police board chair had a great deal of power, and as accountability and transparency chair oversaw the integrity commissioner, he was angry that I targeted the Accountability and Transparency Committee to be accountable and transparent. And he assaulted me after a meeting, and that turned into a huge saga. Ultimately, it comes down to the City Hall would rather be able to work with nobody watching. And that's not how government works. That's not how it works in a democracy. And in fact, if they did their job well, the videos, the reality is when government's functioning well, not many people are paying attention, and that's good. That can be fine. But they were doing their job well. People would go, oh, these guys are not bad at what they're doing. It's when you get into these situations like going back to Thursday's meeting where the city clerk says, well, the council agenda is not a platform. We don't allow just any letter onto the agenda. The letters have to be related to items that are on the agenda that day, which is in fact not true. If you look at a council agenda, they accept a wide range of letters, often letters from citizens and citizens groups asking council to endorse a position on federal or provincial legislation. And that's fine. I actually think it's great that people use their local council as a jumping off point to get involved in civic life and politics. And in fact, I wish that we could figure out a way of having local members of parliament come together on a regular basis to hear citizen delegations on matters that they could then take to Parliament Hill. One thing that's fascinating, I'll quickly say about the American political system, is that representatives in Congress, there's an expectation that you hold the town hall. And yes, we all watch the videos on YouTube of when those town halls get crazy or weird. But that idea that your representative stands humbly in front of you and deals with both the wacky, but also the thoughtful. And we still have that in our councils. I actually think Burlington, for example, I've been quite impressed this term of council where they now have their afternoon session and their evening session, and they take delegations during both. As we're recording this, people are going to hear this after, but our public delegations for council in Hamilton for the budget, which is a requirement of provincial law, once a year they have to hold public delegations in the evening for budget. There's over 50 people who are planning to do a video delegation. And that's going to be a good moment for democracy because a lot of people, that's their first ever time public speaking, their first ever time engaging in democracy. And municipalities should welcome that, embrace it, and facilitate it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the big advantage of municipalities that how they should operate is they are the closest to us. So you can do things. It's pretty difficult for anybody in the province to turn up at the door of the Ontario legislature and kind of knock on it and have their say. But we can do that at a local level. And anybody involved in municipal politics really needs to get behind the idea that this is a good thing, a really good thing, that can transform the way that people feel about politics, because it isn't so remote from them, that you can actually go and see the person you elected and pretty much speak to them direct. I think we have 1,000 miles to go in every municipality in Ontario, and how this is done, and where there have certainly been positive moves. For instance, in Burlington, I could go on at some length about why they're not quite positive enough, but that's me. But there is at least the acknowledgement of, not everybody is available during the day, and so on and so forth. Now, I was going to ask, just sort of widening this out to an extent, do you think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we organize our municipal government that this happens? Because what you're describing is a pattern that can be seen in other places. What is it about our processes, the way that we elect councils, the way that those councils interact with staff, that seems to so often create this really toxic environment that I don't feel exists at other levels of government. Not saying other levels of government are perfect, goodness knows they're not, but you kind of feel that the staff and the politicians are kind of on the same side. Everybody knows whose role is what, and the rules are the rules.
So in Ontario, we have 444 municipalities. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs no longer exercises much of an oversight role. Beyond making sure that a municipality is not running a deficit and not about to become insolvent, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs is hands-off. The water utilities are now heavily regulated after Walkerton. But Walkerton was a good example of where the province just wasn't looking after water systems. So you have no oversight through the ministry. The Ontario Municipal Board, now known as the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, is no longer outside of planning, no longer is an oversight body. At one point it was, for example, municipal budgets had to be approved by the what was at the time the Ontario Municipal and Railway Board. So that's an improvement. We don't want that level of micromanagement. On the staff side, there are many factors, but the staff do not have the job security that exists in the provincial bureaucracy or the federal bureaucracy. In that, at a certain level, your very upper levels of the provincial and federal civil service, in theory, they serve at the pleasure of the government. But in reality, except for the deputy ministers, they all stay on. And somebody who's a deputy minister is they're ready to retire. They're doing that. That's the last thing they do in that career. So the boundaries are more clearly defined. And it's also that so there's an interesting integrity ruling that just went on to Camley in Oshawa, where you had a councillor who emailed the director of municipal bylaw enforcement concerned about how bylaw was handling a group that was handing out free meals in a park during COVID, which was causing gathering. And this is where it's going to improve. Guy Girono, who is a integrity commissioner for multiple municipalities, investigate the matter. Somebody filed a complaint, said this councillor was directing staff, but not just any staff, bylaw enforcement staff, which they are not supposed to do. And Girono did a really good job as integrity commissioner of breaking down what happened, explaining why the councillor should not have done what they had done, even though they were acting in good faith, drawing those clear boundaries, and then issuing a warning to the councillor, which is, you did violate the code, you need to attend a training session, and I would suggest the rest of council take advantage of this training as well. So we are seeing the integrity commissioner role, when done properly, when not abused by a council, is going to slowly start correcting that. And that's what's occurred, is that there's been a lack of external oversight. And the reality is that all of us are fallible, and we need checks and balances. And without those checks and balances, even in good faith, we make mistakes. And so while Hamilton is an example of bad faith, a lot of these things that start occurring in municipalities, a lot of these small examples are personality conflicts or just people meaning to do the right thing, but not realizing where those lines are. And that's because, take, for example, I'll say like a small municipality, your chief administrative officer could also be the guy who cuts the grass at the local park because you have 3 staff in your entire municipality.
It's one of those things that, we tend to forget that anybody can run and be elected for public office. There's no there's no job description that you have to fill out other than being of proper age and being really a citizen of Canada. So you have an excellent point there that people do have good intentions, but we forget sometimes that the rule book is a rather complicated and lengthy one, and not everyone's an expert on the process, which might come back to our issue with Hamilton, that you want to get things done, and sometimes that rule book looks a little tedious to have to go through or to have to read with a fine-tooth comb to understand it, but that's part of your job.
It's also like, take for example the advisory committees. So the city clerk destroys the videos of their meetings as soon as they're done. I now record them while they're broadcasting live. The city clerk says, well, the Municipal Act doesn't require me to keep the records, and I've declared that they're not a record, which a video is a record, but the problem is that for me to uphold that and to take the clerk to court over it is a couple $1,000s and lots of my time. But, as I've tweeted a few times, this clampdown that's occurring on citizen committees, which we saw taken to the extreme with the LGBTQ committee, I always sort of shake and go, so they're advocating for things that City Hall doesn't like. If you go back on the records of citizen committees, they've always advocated for things that City Hall doesn't agree with. And I've often said, I don't understand why the clerk doesn't do the same thing, which they've always done, which is just ignore them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
There's a very hollow laugh coming from me right there. Advisory committees are kind of a joke. I mean, they shouldn't be. They absolutely should be the driving force behind how citizens engage with councils in a more meaningful way. But they range between coffee clutches and kind of activist groups trying to operate within City Hall, and neither is ultimately the right approach. They usually don't have a budget. They often don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. It's a ludicrous system, and again, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's like they have no standing really within a city other than to give advice, which there is no obligation on anybody to listen to. It's so bizarre that they would go down this road, and it's so self-defeating. It's going back to the sort of grade 5 civics lessons or whatever grade it was, I can't remember. It's like if you were telling someone how to stay out of trouble in politics, it would be like, don't do stuff like this. This is ridiculous. You don't need to. Just steer clear of it. Everything will be fine.
I do have a question that this you probably don't have an answer to, but do they think what they're doing is okay, and do they think that they'll get away with it, like telling the public you can't tell us that we're doing a bad thing, and they think the public's going to be okay with this?
They think they can get away with it, yeah, and they have been able to get away with it in the past. But again, it gets to, and this is why there's such a violent, both figurative and literal reaction to my journalism, is that they could get away with it before because nobody could see what they were doing. And now people can see it. And, when you study politics, the most successful municipal politicians are generally actually quite boring. They just get the job done week in, week out. Or, in the case of, Hamilton's longest serving mayor, Bob Morrow, you can't really point to big projects that he did, and you can't really point to initiatives he did, but he was boring. He had a few controversies, which, he probably should have got more heat for, but he took care of what you expect of a mayor. And I think that that's one of the great challenges for politicians today, is that they believe that they're going to hold a great deal of power. And maybe that's because that's how we romanticize it, both in fictional media and then even when you look at professional journalism. We always talk about Justin Trudeau decided this, Doug Ford decided that, when in reality, actually, especially at the municipal level, the mayor is one vote of how many people on council. And so that's where I think we end up in these situations.
Yeah, very few candidates for municipal office understand quite how weak they are going to be if they're elected, and quite how the extent to which they cannot set any kind of agenda. Now, the mayor has slightly more clout, but not a huge amount. I mean, and it varies from city to city. I know in Toronto, they've kind of got special exemptions to an extent from the way that municipalities usually act. But you feel that's, if there were qualifications for the job, that would be the most important one. Like, do you realize that you are the guy who says yay or nay to things that other people have decided, not you? And fine, you've got the veto on it if you can get enough votes from your colleagues. But it's to think of a mayor as the prime minister of a city is such a fundamental misunderstanding. And yeah, they probably would do well to appreciate that a little bit better. Well, thanks so much, Joey, for coming on again. And it's absolutely fascinating. And I think one of the things we hope in this podcast is to kind of shine a light on how these things work for people, because we do, like you say, the average level of knowledge of how city halls actually operate is so low. And yet it affects every, we all pay attention to power and politics, which on a day-to-day level hardly affects us at all. And we have no idea what's going on down the road at City Hall. And it is, when you get it explained to you a bit better, really interesting, and just shocking sometimes how dysfunctional it becomes. So we really appreciate you coming on again to talk about the latest
shenanigans,
diversions. Yeah, the latest shenanigans of Hamilton City Hall. And it's going to be a very interesting 18 months until the next election, I have to say.
It's going to be very fascinating. There's so much going on in the community. I think the most fascinating thing will be once in-person organizing can resume again. Some of these citizen groups that have been forming across the city that start reconnecting, it's going to be fascinating to see what becomes of it and how do all of the political dynamics play out in Hamilton. It's going to be fascinating, but it's going to be fascinating right across the entire of Southern Ontario, because I actually think people are also realizing government does more than pick up garbage.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on.
Take care, guys. Have a good one. Bye.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.